January 23rd, 1960. 65 years ago today, the waters off of Guam were a little rough, but nothing that the freighter ship Santa Maria couldn't handle. However, it was a different story for the vessel that was in tow behind her, named Trieste. A number of instruments had been damaged or destroyed, such as the underwater telephone, the vertical current meter, and the device that measured her rate of ascent and descent. You see, she was like the submersibles we discussed in episode 4, capable of diving deep underwater, but requiring the assistance of a surface ship, in this case the Santa Maria. But she neither looked nor functioned like a submersible, no. Her methods were entirely different. With all of these concerns, it seems clear that today's dive should have been aborted. After all, the current plan was for Trieste to descend for 5 hours, stay at depth for 30 minutes, and take 3 hours to ascend. An 8.5-hour voyage made by a vessel ill-equipped to surface in the dark, meaning if she was going to dive today, it would have to be now. On top of all this, not everyone in the Navy's chain of command was on board with Trieste's dive. At a moment's notice, the Santa Maria could receive a phone call telling her to shut down the project. Truly, this may very well have been the last chance Trieste had to complete her mission. But what was this mission? Well, as we have been building up to over the last 4 episodes, Trieste was going to be the first vessel to touch the bottom of the ocean, the true bottom, a depth at which none could ever descend beyond. But on that day, Santa Maria did indeed receive a call, the phone being picked up by one Dr. Andreas Rechnitzer, informing the crew that the project was to be canceled and that Trieste was not to go forward with her record-breaking dive. In that moment, Dr. Rechnitzer had to make a choice, one that could forever change history. Unable to comply, Trieste is passing 10,000 feet. As Rechnitzer could look out over the side and see Trieste bobbing in the waves, she was most definitely not passing 10,000 feet. Moments away from descending, sure, but the mission could still be aborted. But the Navy didn't know that. If Trieste was that far down now, the Santa Maria would have to stay there to retrieve her upon surfacing. Rechnitzer's little lie allowed Trieste's crew, Jacques Picard and Don Walsh, to become the deepest men alive. And at 8:23 a.m., that fib paid off. Trieste had begun her dive. Welcome to the final episode of this series. If this is your first time tuning in, be sure to watch the first 4 episodes first, and to subscribe for more like this. With that out of the way, let's get into it. Trieste was unlike anything the world had seen before. Like a submersible, she needed the assistance of a surface vessel to get her to her diving point. But unlike a submersible, she did not have ballast tanks. So how did she vertically traverse the deep? The secret lies in her shape. This little sphere down here is known as a bathysphere, slung beneath other ships to allow people to look into the waters below. This is where Picard and Walsh would remain for the duration of the dive. Made of incredibly thick steel with a single 5-inch thick glass porthole to look out of with plexiglass covering it, this was the only way for the 2 men to view the outside world. This large balloon-like structure here is what allowed her to ascend and descend. It acted similarly to airships, which are filled with gases like helium and hydrogen, both lighter than the air around them, and allowing the lighter-than-air craft to stay afloat. My description of buoyancy from last episode was admittedly somewhat lacking, so I will attempt to do it justice here. This blimp here is lighter than the air it is displacing, meaning it is buoyant. Some parts of the blimp are obviously heavier than the air, but some, namely the helium-filled parts, are lighter, and it's enough that the whole blimp is on average lighter. Trieste followed the same design philosophy, but instead of helium or hydrogen in her float, there was gasoline, which is a liquid like water, but lighter. Using a liquid was another crucial component. Remember what I said all the way back in episode 1 about liquids not wanting to compress easily like air? Well, by filling the float with a liquid, the hull could not implode anywhere near as easily as if it had been filled with gas. Because it made Trieste lighter than the water, she needed something to help her sink. This was accomplished with iron shot as her ballast. Iron was used instead of lead because while lighter than the latter, iron was magnetic and so could be controlled magnetically. An electromagnetic current ran along Trieste to her ballast, and it could be shut off to drop it when the time came to ascend. 7 miles down, any kind of moving mechanization might not be strong enough to function due to the extreme pressure, and using magnets circumvented this problem. She became what's known as a bathyscaphe, a truly unique design, with very few other like her in existence. A mere 10 minutes into the dive, Trieste encountered a problem. They had hit a thermocline, a section of water that drops rapidly in temperature. Cold water sinks below warm water because the molecules have less energy, move slower, and therefore are more closely packed together. Because of this, Trieste would not descend below. Now, the bathyscaphe could wait until the gasoline had cooled down so as to make it sink, but that would take time, and they were already running the risk of surfacing in the dark. The other option was to let out gasoline to make her sink. Picard and Walsh knew they could let out a certain amount and still surface after all the iron shot had been jettisoned. But how many times would they hit a thermocline? Ultimately, they decided the risk was worth it, and so letting out a little gasoline, they continued their descent. It happened again at 335 feet, and yet again at 425, with the deepest being at 530 feet. Each time, gasoline was let out to resume their journey. The inside of the capsule became cold from the frigid waters around Picard and Walsh, who proceeded to put on warm clothes. The mission continued on uneventfully, with the men occasionally switching on the outside lights to peer into the murky abyss, occasionally seeing bioluminescent organisms swimming around in the eternal blackness. If their descent seemed too quick at times, they would release a bundle of ballast to slow themselves down. What was that? It seems they were still alive. Must not be anything serious. Picard and Walsh knew that if the hull failed, they would not be alive to experience any sort of fear, something that neither had felt the whole dive. And at 11:06 a.m., just under 5 hours after departing the surface, Trieste's descent halted, and a cloud of silt rose from beneath her. Humanity had reached full ocean depth. Picard and Walsh ultimately stayed at depth for 20 minutes, deciding that the remaining 10 were not necessary. They made note of a few organisms they saw at the bottom, proving that life could exist even in the most extreme environments. They described seeing a flatfish, similar to a flounder. However, fish have never been observed for several thousand feet above in the water column. It's more likely they saw a species of gastropod, which at these depths often appears similar to fluke. They also saw shrimp-like creatures, and arthropods have indeed been seen at these depths. Upon returning to the ship, the outside of Trieste was inspected, and the cause of the cracking sound was discovered. The plexiglass covering the window had cracked, but not from pressure. Final science lesson. As materials cool, they shrink. But different materials shrink different amounts. The steel surrounding the plexiglass had shrunk more, and so had squeezed it into cracking. Picard and Walsh had been in no danger at all. But with all of that said, here we are 65 years later, and we have hardly ever been back to full ocean depth. In fact, we rarely ever dive deep to begin with. Ocean science has long been considered unimportant, and so it struggles to get funding. Even the team behind Trieste barely managed to make their historic dive possible. Recently, however, people have begun to see the importance in understanding what makes up more than 70% of our planet's surface. And so this series is not over. I told you there would be 5 episodes, but like Dr. Recknitzer, I lied. There will be a 6th episode to conclude this series, as we still need to talk about